As farmers finished off harvest in the field this year, Illinois Corn and Lauren Lurkins were also busy with an educational series at ethanol plants throughout the state. We are excited to have Lauren here to talk to us more about the crossroads of carbon and corn. Thanks for being here today, Lauren.
Yeah, thanks, Haley. We had a great set of meetings across the state partnering with ethanol plants. We had a number of farmers and landowners join us. And in the conversation, we really focused on 4 different buckets. The first is what ethanol has meant for corn farmers and corn markets. The second big bucket of issues and discussion was really the list of threats that are facing the ethanol industry and corn farmers today. The third, we talked about opportunities, and namely carbon capture and sequestration. In that conversation, we didn't rely on me and my minor in geology from undergrad, but we really brought in Dr. Sally Greenberg. She is a geologist that has focused on this issue for the last 30 years around Decatur at the ADM site. And Dr. Sally Greenberg had done an earlier webinar with Illinois Corn where she really went into the entire discussion for about an hour. In our set of meetings, we actually just focused on 3 of her pieces of information. The first is really the background on what carbon capture and sequestration even is. The second, she focused on the safety and monitoring around the well site, because there's a lot of questions about that very complicated regulatory process. And the third, she focused on why Illinois is ideal geologically for carbon capture and sequestration. And so that was a very good conversation in depth about the opportunities. And finally, we talked about new markets that can be unlocked with the addition of carbon capture and sequestration. So if we go back through just in a little bit more detail, when we think about the first bucket and really what ethanol has meant for the corn industry, we started that conversation by really looking back at the 80s and the corn prices that we all remember. And what changed was the introduction of the ethanol industry. At that time, there were policy drivers at the federal level, namely the Renewable Fuels Standard in 2005 and an amendment to the Renewable Fuels Standard in 2007 that really paved the way for the ethanol industry to flourish. Here in Illinois, we talk about the 13 different ethanol plants that are currently in operation across the state. And we did show one map that actually shows all of those ethanol plants in the state with the grain draw associated with each plant. That was interesting to the farmers in the audience because while they may be familiar with what's around them in their home location, they kind of forget what's the rest of the story statewide. So it was interesting to see the impact that the ethanol industry had across the state in their minds. The second bucket that I talked about was really the bad news, and that's the threats. We focused on 4 different threats that are currently facing the ethanol industry. The first is something that the farmers in the crowd really recalled from the summer, which was a US EPA proposed rule all about an EV mandate. At that time, Illinois Corn and other farm groups did calls to action to alert people to the issue, but that was something that we talked about has a massive it could have a massive impact if it's turned into a final rule. The second threat that we focused on was a Department of Transportation proposal on the efficiency of the fleet that would really be hand in glove with that EPA EV mandate. The third, we talked about state-level electric vehicle mandates, starting with the state of California and ending up with 16 additional states really following the lead of California and requiring EVs by X date in the state. And the third and final threat that we talked about were state low-carbon fuel standards that are geared primarily focused on those EV kind of mandates and not thinking about sort of Midwestern row crop and the opportunities that would become thinking about homegrown feedstocks. The third big bucket that we talked about is really those opportunities. Like I said, we called upon Dr. Sally Greenberg to talk about the 3 areas that we covered before, what carbon capture and sequestration is, safety, and also our geology here in Illinois. And we really talked about the opportunities either to take that CO2 from the ethanol plants and utilize it for other industrial purposes or sequester it. And then finally, what what is really unlocked are those market opportunities. When you think about ethanol with a low carbon intensity score to start with, and even reducing that carbon intensity score even lower with carbon capture and sequestration, you really unlock a lot of potential markets. The most exciting thing, I think, for farmers in these meetings was really the conversation around sustainable aviation fuel, the push behind the Biden administration to focus on that opportunity and really that opportunity for other markets to be open when we think about that low carbon score attached with ethanol. And really those other markets are Brazil and their low carbon fuel standard. We talked about international sustainable aviation fuel markets, including Japan. We talked about future low carbon fuel standards that really think about the Midwest and not just primarily about electric vehicles. And then finally, we talked about higher blends of ethanol in your gas tank with legislation like the Next Generation Fuels Act. So it was a very robust presentation, but really conversation in each of these areas.
Well, thank you for that summary there. And as we talked about earlier, there was a lot of great turnout for this event. And one of our main goals was not just to talk to farmers, but to listen and hear these concerns, hear their thoughts around these topics. And so we're going to dive into a couple of these questions that were frequently asked at all these events throughout the state. But one of the main ones that we heard is, with carbon capture and storage, what does the timeline for this technology look like?
That is a great question. We had this timeline question in almost every one of the meetings. And really the answer is that currently, each ethanol plant is undergoing its own process for due diligence, really getting the approvals if they need to make some capital investments, really exploring the opportunities for that capital investment. Also trying to figure out how to navigate any regulatory permitting that would be needed. And so I think that is all underway today. There's also a couple rulemakings at the federal level that folks are waiting for, particularly with regard to pipelines at the federal level. And then also really the GREET model discussions out of the Treasury Department. Those are all currently underway and decisions have not been made. And so that will all be cleared up. I think what we were saying, our expected timeline is this stuff all starting to become reality at the end of 2024 or early 2025.
Another question that was frequently asked was, if my farm is near an ethanol plant, does that mean my pore space is valuable? Does that in turn make my farmland more valuable?
Yeah, we had this conversation, especially, given the individuals in the audience. If they were located next to a plant or a well site, they were very interested in knowing what was the potential opportunity for them with regard to pore space. And I think the short answer is that yes, that pore space and that land, that farmland, has a lot of value. It would be our recommendation to have that individual landowner or farmer have ongoing communications with the ethanol plant so that individual can fully understand what the ethanol plant is thinking by way of its business plan in the near term and the long term. And then also, of course, don't forget to consult those professionals, those engineers, those attorneys, to be able to help the individual landowner make the best decision possible for their farm.
And then why are ethanol plants invested or interested in this technology?
I think ethanol plants and agriculture in general, they're interested in this technology, and they're not alone. When you look at other industries across our country, whether it's power plants or cement factories, others are all interested in responding to a bunch of different demands for them to really minimize their environmental footprint, while at the same time being relevant into the future, being profitable into the future. Ethanol, in my view, has a leg up on other industries because the CO2 that is produced through its processes is pure CO2, and there's a lot less steps, fewer steps that need to be taken to turn it into something that can be more valuable.
And so we know that carbon capture and storage can lower corn's carbon intensity score, but also farming practices, when they're doubled with that, can also do that. So how are our farmers, looking to the future? How are they going to be compensated for this?
This is an area of not just questions, but thorough discussion in every single meeting. I think the farmers are excited that there are tax credits and benefits to the ethanol industry, so that way they can continue to be relevant and take deliveries of grain at their doorstep. But farmers are obviously interested in, how they can benefit as well. They're very interested because for decades we've talked here in Illinois about the practices like no-till, cover crops, nutrient management. We've talked about those practices for purposes of water quality improvements and soil sequestration of carbon. And now it's really unlocking that opportunity for others to be able to take on those practices. And so the big conversation was focused on a slide that was part of this discussion that really showed the 50% reduction of the GHG footprint of petroleum jet fuel. The farmers all identified that GHG footprint really drops on corn ethanol when you have carbon capture and sequestration, but it drops even more when you have these added practices that are more in-field practices that can be adopted by the farmers. So with that, they were thinking and having great conversations about the potential for that even lower carbon intensity score from the farm to get them a higher premium upon delivery. To me, I think this is the next big area of advocacy to make sure that farmers can share some of that benefit financially at the farm. The other conversation that happened was how this opportunity is much different than the earlier conversations that the industry has had on carbon markets. Early adopters of all of those practices were sort of shut out of opportunities on carbon markets. This is different. This is almost equal opportunity. If you take on the practices, you take them on year after year, or it's your first time doing so, you could potentially see a higher premium upon delivery. So again, to me, this is that next area of advocacy for farm groups like Illinois Corn.
Yeah, and you're talking about tax credits and public policy. I know, right now this is a big push by the administration, but another question our farmers had is what happens if public policy changes? How does that change this technology and what we're looking into right now?
That is a great conversation. We didn't talk a lot about politics in these meetings. We talked more about the substantive policy and the sort of engineering and geology. But really, I think if you look back at Dr. Sally Greenberg's longer webinar, she does address this question. She personally had worked for 3 decades in the Decatur area on this and really watching the investment from our federal government, namely the Department of Energy, through multiple administrations focused on how not only agriculture but also other industries can continue to be relevant while minimizing their carbon footprint. And so, I think she had said in that webinar that really she was not worried about that. I think I would share that same perspective, maybe for a little bit different of a reason. I think, you're going to have the sunsetting of a lot of these tax credits. We're probably all going to learn a little bit in the years to come, but we'll all have that advocacy opportunity when those tax credits are sunsetting to make sure that we're there and having conversations, and that keeps people interested and at the table. And I think my final thought is really that you've got a lot of capital investment happening across the industry, the ethanol industry today, and folks are going to want to continue to see that operational and efficient and profitable through other administrations in the future.
Well, Lauren, was there anything else that you learned or heard throughout your time in this series that you'd like to share with us?
I think the overall thing I would say is that there is a massive interest in the sustainable aviation fuel and the markets that would come from that opportunity. Just over and over again, just questions and excitement about that opportunity. And the final thing that I probably want to close with is one of the comments from the farmer who had attended our meetings. He was very inquisitive throughout the entire presentation, and at the end, he said, if I hear what you're saying now, let me see if I got this right. It's pretty good to be a corn farmer today. And if all of this shakes out the way that we want it to, it's going to be very good to be a corn farmer in the future. And I just thought that sentiment really wraps up the entire point of the presentation and the point of the roadshow itself.
Well, thank you so much for your expertise on this topic. We're glad to be able to have you here today and look forward to talking to you more about this in the future.